All right, moving on to part 2 of the lecture. This part should be very interesting because we're going to look at a specific example. At the end of the previous recording, I accidentally said Sam Anderson's Just One More Game, which is an article I teach in a different class. I just happened to say the wrong example. The reason I'm really excited for this part of the lecture is the example we're going to look at is an analysis of the film you also watched for this lesson, Spider-Man Far From Home. So we have 3 objectives here, and they're the 3 points you can see in the title of part 2 here. So one is to have an example of critical reading. The second is to consider visual analysis and how important that is as a type of critical reading we do, because so much of the media we encounter in our culture today is not just the written word. And finally, fake news, as you could argue a theme of this film and of this sample essay we're going to look at, but also a theme for this class. Not just fake news, but fake media. Anytime people, authors, creators are overtly trying to manipulate us through the media. So those are our 3 objectives, to study those 3 things. This lesson is going to primarily focus on critical reading of the written word. I'm going to demonstrate that for you. But because you ideally got a good dose of that in 101, and if you were in my 101 class, you definitely did, I'm not going to ask you to do that in the discussion board post. I'm just going to demonstrate it here. For the discussion board post, I'm going to ask you to do visual analysis and have you take these critical reading skills but apply them in the visual realm rather than the written realm, because I believe as 201 students, you're already ready to go to that level. And then finally, fake news is more of a theme we'll focus on throughout the entire quarter, as I mentioned before, as we hone our media literacy skills. It's not really a main emphasis in this lesson, but it comes up because it's a prominent theme in this film. That's why I've picked this film. One other quick note. When I teach critical reading and do critical reading of the written word, I usually use some kind of article or essay. For this particular class and this particular lesson, the article or essay I've chosen is actually a student example from a previous course. I chose it for several reasons. One, it's an excellent example of a student essay, but also because it's a great analysis of this film. And like I said, I think this film will be a foundational text for us in this class. It will launch us into a study of how rhetoric works in the media right now. And not only is it a great analysis of this film, but it discusses exactly that, how the film addresses rhetorical manipulation in the media. So it's really just a perfect fit for our class. But it's not something I came up with on my own. It's a student work, so it's very impressive. One thing I'll say about student examples, the point here is not to see an ideal student essay. I will give you more examples throughout the quarter as you get closer to writing your papers for the class. But even when I give you those, the goal is never to mimic the style real closely. You should have your own style, your own voice as a writer. It's more so to just give you an idea. These are some of the strengths, some of the weaknesses we're looking for. That will inevitably come up in this lesson since we're looking at a student sample, but it's not the main focus as it will be in later lessons when we look at more student examples. Here, the main focus is how to do critical reading, and 2, what does this film teach us about how the media manipulates us. My approach for doing a sample critical reading of this student essay is to go through the critical reading strategies from the end of part 1 of the lecture. The first 2 strategies, to adjust your reading speed depending on what you're reading and to annotate while you read, incredibly important, but not something I can actually demonstrate in the lecture. Rather, those are things I did while I was reading the article, and hopefully you did too. But if we get to the third step, summarizing in your own words, I can demonstrate that in the lecture. So we're going to start there and go through each of the strategies in the order I covered them on the last slide. I don't want to diminish the importance of adjusting reading speed and annotating, highlighting while you read. It's just I guess I could put highlighted pages on the screen or something, but it just seems like that's something you do on your own, going to demonstrate the other steps. But nonetheless, very important part of critical reading, those first two steps. So like I said on the previous portion of the lecture, a really crucial way to demonstrate your understanding of something you've read is to be able to repeat the main idea of the piece you've read, but in your own words. So quoting is easy. We can just pull a quote from anywhere, but quoting something does not show that we understand it. Taking that quote and conveying the same meaning but through our own words shows that we've understood it. And this echoes truly in your papers, because when I read your papers later in the quarter, I'm not going to be impressed necessarily by really long quotations. Rather, I want to see that what you've read and incorporated into your paper, you truly understand. And so paraphrasing in your own words is a more effective way to demonstrate that to me and any reader. And this student paper is a really good example of that, because the student grapples with some pretty big, complex ideas and has some really good sources that engage with those ideas, but the quotes from the sources are quite short, and the student has really good explanations in his own words of the meanings of those quotes. And we'll see some of that on later slides. But here we're focusing on the critical reading strategy of summarizing the reading's main idea in your own words. So to illustrate this, I have the student's thesis, which, like any great thesis, is succinct, says the argument the paper is making, and can be found at the end of the introductory paragraph, so it's fresh in the reader's mind as they read the rest of the paper. But here it is. Spider-Man Far From Home narrates a core struggle of an individual living in today's postmodern culture, a struggle for the truth while surrounded by lies. And I have my proper in-text citation there, because it comes on page 1. So just kind of note that you'll need to have good citations in your own papers. Here is the main idea of the article in my own words. This is how I would sum it up. If someone asked me to sum up this paper in one sentence, here's what I would say. Spider-Man is an everyman hero, a hero to whom everyone can relate. In the film, Spider-Man Far From Home, Spidey's struggle is one we all face today, trying to find the truth in a world of lies. Sorry for the misspelling there, and then the mispronunciation on my part. It should be world of lies. So you have the phrase in the original, the film narrates a core struggle of such and such. I thought to put that kind of in my own words, I would say that Spider-Man is this everyday hero. You know, he's a kid. He gets scared while fighting. He cracks jokes. He struggles to pay his rent. He's someone we can all relate to. And so when you read Spider-Man comics or watch Spider-Man films or shows, one thing that often comes up is struggles that we all face. So what is the particular struggle that he's facing in this particular film? It's being surrounded by a world of lies and trying to discern the truth. If you've seen the film, you've seen him battling Mysterio, and there's all these illusions around him, and he can't tell what's real or what's not. If you try to read the news or engage with media in our culture, it feels very much the same way. And that's what the student's saying here. I said if you've seen the film, obviously you have, but in case you haven't watched it before the lecture, you should watch it before the lecture. That's why I phrased that statement that way. So this is taking what the student has said and putting it in my own words. I try to be as clear as possible, so I even give a definition of everyman there. But the student statement was already, very straightforward. But again, if you can put it in your own words, that shows you understand it. And the last sentence here, I probably didn't change enough. Fine for my own edification, fine for my own notes while reading or watching, but if I were to actually be paraphrasing this in my own paper, I would want to change the structure and language of the sentence even more than I did. And that's just something to keep in your mind as you go forward and write for this class, because like I said, paraphrasing is much more important than quoting because it shows you understand it. But hopefully you get the idea here. The next thing I talked about as a strategy was rhetorical situation, which connects back to our first lecture in the most obvious way of anything we discussed today. But really all of critical reading has to do with rhetoric, because to understand rhetoric, we have to critically read all the media in front of us that's using rhetoric to try to persuade us or maybe even manipulate us to things. So in the first lecture, I covered the different elements of rhetoric, of a rhetorical situation. I'm going to cover each one of those quickly now with the student paper for you. So the purpose for this student, their goal was to write a successful English 201 paper. The student's audience was obviously the English 201 instructor, me, and the classmates, but anyone really. This is a very accessible paper. It deals with some big ideas, but I thought the student explained them in a very clear and straightforward manner. And so this could really be published in an online journal or something, because I think it's a very engaging piece. Even if you weren't in the 201 class where we're studying superheroes, it would still really make sense. I mean, even if you haven't seen the movie, there's probably enough summary there to engage anybody, which is what you want to aim for. If you write to too narrow of an audience, only those people will understand what you're saying. So you want to explain your ideas in a clear way. And we'll talk more about that later in the quarter, but you usually need the feedback of others to help get your writing to that place. The genre is obviously an English 201 paper, so there's certain things you'll see here that you wouldn't see in other kinds of writing, but also it was a type of paper where I asked students to include visuals and to make it a very kind of modern paper that almost looks like a kind of article you read on a website. So the genre is an English 201 paper, but really an English 201 paper, meant to look like a web article. Finally, the student's stance or thesis was Spider-Man Far From Home exemplifies the struggle to find truth amidst lies that we all face while living in a postmodern world. So another restatement of the student's thesis in my own words. This is probably actually a better job than I did on the previous slide, because it is truly one sentence and more distinct from the student's own thesis, at least in the sentence structure and word use, etc. And what I'll say is, these steps we're going through a progressive. So first we paraphrase our own words. Next, we're looking at the rhetorical situation. We'll do some other strategies in a minute. When you critically read something, the first step is to be able to say in one sentence, or just very quickly, briefly, concisely, what the meaning of the piece is to show you understand it. But at the end of this lecture, I'll have kind of a longer explanation in my own words, and that's to show that not only do you understand its meaning, but you've read it really deeply and can actually offer some kind of critique of that, again, which is what I'll give at the end of this lecture. Finally, the media or the design is the written word with visuals. So purpose, audience, and stance, it's really clear why those are important to consider when you're critically analyzing, critically reading something, because you want to know why the author did this and for whom and what they say. Genre and media or design we didn't talk about as much in lesson 1, but they're still very important, because if you're writing something for, say, a class like this versus, say, like a Facebook post or an email, you're going to do things a little differently. So if we're trying to read for understanding and purpose and critique that piece, we need to know the constraints or the expectations of the genre. Finally, the way it looks can have a lot to do with its success or failure to a certain audience within a certain genre. And so because I asked students for this assignment to do sort of a web article looking piece, the student included visuals. You're probably used mostly to just the written word in 101 and 201 classes. So this particular example shows kind of the trends of my classes and of composition classes in general as we continue to move further into the 21st century. But through this example, then you can see how genre and media or design are important, maybe more so than you might have realized at first glance. The next thing I talked about was identifying patterns. And there were two types of patterns I mentioned, which were keywords and key concepts. So keywords are just terms or phrases. It could be one word or it could be kind of a few words close together, but really words that are either brand new words, because sometimes writers invent words, or they're using the word in maybe a different way than we typically use it for the purpose of their article or piece they've written. Or maybe just a word that's difficult to understand, like, for instance, postmodernism. Maybe not everyone knows what that means or how the student's using it. And on the next slide, we'll look at the other type of pattern, just key concepts. So these are more than just one word or several words. They're whole ideas, and usually they involve the keywords. And again, patterns are things that recur throughout the piece you're reading, that show up multiple times. So if you're saying a word over and over again, like, for instance, postmodern in this essay, you want to highlight that. And then if you don't know what it means or don't understand how the writer's using it, you want to look it up, figure that out, and kind of have like a decoding, if you will, of the keywords, so that you really understand the meaning of the pieces you read it. There's a couple examples from this student essay. Postmodernism, obviously, student does a great job to define some terms. Postmodernism is the ideology which claims that reality itself is subjective and which encompasses moral relativism. Moral relativism is probably a term the student should define too, but I love the phrase in the sentence, to define some terms. So whenever you're writing a paper that might have some challenging keywords, which is more often than you think, because we'll talk more about this later in the quarter, but there's always a gap between writer and reader, and even if something is really clear to you, it might not be clear to your readers, your audience. That's why we need others to critique our writing before we turn it in or publish it. So to just provide an early definition of some of the key terms is a great rhetorical move a writer can make, that this student does here and even says so directly. And postmodernism is a difficult concept to understand. There are whole classes on it, but I think the student sums it up really quickly. And the way I would just phrase that for you in my own words is that if you think of morality, there's really two ways to think of morality, and that's either as objective or subjective. So objective morality would be a statement like, murder is wrong. It's wrong to commit murder. Subjective morality would be, rather than what is moral, immoral being defined by an external objective standard like the law that murder is wrong, it would be every individual person gets to determine their own subjective decision of what's right or what's wrong. And that's really the shift from the culture in the United States being one that viewed morality as objective. It's become much more subjective. And really a big part of this student's paper is noting that change. And that's why he has the phrase encompasses moral relativism here. Morality is relative, individual, or subjective rather than objective. So it's a good, clear, succinct definition that makes sense. And it's very important, this shift in the culture in the U.S., as we'll see when we get to the next slide and look at some key concepts. Another important term he used was political division. He says, in other words, again, a sentence that shows he's defining terms, Merritt and Salgado claim that some of the political division we see today is a reaction against the effects of postmodernism. So you get a culture like ours in the U.S. that emphasizes subjective morality, and you end up having these divisions, right? Because some people believe something is moral and a different group of people believe it's immoral, and there's not one objective moral standard for them to adhere to on that particular issue. Now, this subject matter, this paper goes into some weighty areas here. So I'll just say real quickly that while there are benefits to subjective morality, and there's certain situations where something might be seen as moral in one situation but not in another, it can be at times a good thing. For instance, self-defense, right? When someone kills another human being, takes their life, there may be very good reason for it if their life was in danger, and we have to look subjectively at each situation to see if that was the case. But the problem, the inherent danger of shifting in a huge way to a more subjective or relatively moral culture, as we have in the US, is that it becomes really hard to distinguish the truth from lies, which is what the Spider-Man film depicts so clearly. So let's see how these two keywords, postmodernism and political division, play out, how the student uses them. And so two key concepts are illustrated in these two quotes from the student's paper. The first one dealing with postmodernism. Postmodernism and moral relativism came to cultural prevalence in America in the latter half of the 20th century. So this is that cultural shift from objective morality to relative or subjective morality. And I already discussed this, but here it's a concept. So this is an idea. The student is saying this is what has happened in the US in the last half century. But you needed to understand the term postmodernism to understand this idea. So you see how recurring words and recurring ideas are both important to define when critically reading a piece. Here's the one that has to do with political division, the second key term. Postmodernism continues to affect culture today through the division of different social groups. And this division and controversy is the situation that is displayed in Peter Parker, Spider-Man's world. So here we have a couple of trends, cultural trends, you could say the writer has identified. One is that postmodernism or relative morality came to prominence in the last half century. The other is that this postmodernism moving forward in the 21st century has led to sharp political divisions, sharper than those divisions have ever been in the history of our country, which I think is really true when you look at the last 10 years or so of politics. So these are two ideas that are crucial to the student's argument. If the student doesn't convey these ideas clearly, these concepts clearly, the argument of the paper won't work. And if the reader doesn't understand the terms postmodern and political divisions, how the student's using them, they won't understand these concepts, won't understand the paper. So defining keywords and key concepts is really important. And then to bring it back to critical reading, us as the reader, we have to interpret and understand those as we read in order to be able to offer a fair critique of the piece and understand what the author's trying to do, their motives, etc. So once we define those key words and key concepts, we can start to understand the meaning of the paper. This is what the writer is telling me. And then we can analyze that. And when we analyze the argument, like I said in part one of the lecture, the way to do that is believing and doubting. Let's play the tape to the end if we agree. Let's play the tape to the end if we disagree. And so what we're going to do on these next two slides is take the student's first body paragraph after they've defined all those terms and concepts and shown that history, the first concept where he really starts analyzing the film, and play the believing and doubting game. Go through the student's argument and see if it makes sense. So on these two slides, I'll also break down kind of the three most important parts of an argument when we make one. The first really important part is the topic sentence, subpoint, or claim. So an argument is a claim, a thesis, a stance, something you can debate, something that some people will disagree with. And you have an overarching thesis for the whole paper. We looked at that on the first slide of this part 2 of the lecture. But then you have subpoints, little mini thesis statements or little mini claims throughout the paper that support that main thesis. And when you get to your analysis, when you start presenting and analyzing evidence to prove that thesis, you want to start each of those paragraphs, first sentence, with a topic sentence. And the topic sentence is an opening sentence of the paragraph that contains the subpoint or the claim or the little mini thesis. So here's the student's first one of those. In Spider-Man Far From Home, an impact that social groups have on the individual can be inferred when the villain of the movie, Quentin Beck, immerses Peter Parker in an illusion and presents Peter with a loved one in danger. So that idea of sharp political divisions leading people to have biases where they believe what everyone who agrees with them says rather than being skeptical, and how that can be dangerous. We talked about on the last slide. Essentially, the mini claim here, the topic sentence is, we see that social group bias because of political division. We see that in Spider-Man Far From Home. That's the thesis of this student's paragraph. Let's see if we believe that or doubt that by following the logic of the argument. So the first thing someone needs to do when they support an argument is give us evidence. Here is the student's evidence, a description of the scene of a scene from the film. I know this isn't real, Peter boldly claims. Do you, though? Do you, though? Beck replies, while dropping Peter's illusory friend to her death. As Peter contradicts his statement by diving after the illusion, Beck exclaims, I don't think you know what's real, Peter. So that's a scene described from the movie. There's no analysis there. If the student doesn't go on and explain how this example from the film proves the argument above, ineffective. We'll be doubting. But let's go to the next slide and see if the student analyzes this in a way that will cause us to believe the statement above. So here is what the student says to prove that claim. Beck makes the point that when our sources of objective fact are manipulated, in this case the physical senses, we will subconsciously believe the manipulation without a second thought. People may mentally acknowledge this principle, yet they succumb to it all the time with the us versus them assumption. This assumption is that the group of people one surrounds oneself with is objectively right, while all other groups are misguided in their thinking. In Peter's case, it was his physical senses of sight and hearing that failed him. In our case, it is the like-minded people we surround ourselves with that leave us open to considering mere opinion or even outright lies to be truth. So it's a complex argument, but if we follow the logic of it, I think it actually makes a great deal of sense. So with everything the student outlined when defining key words and concepts about the current political divisions in our morally relative country, you have situations where people tend to, I think we're all guilty of this to a certain degree, surround themselves with others who think like-mindedly. And if we only accept what the people who are like us, who we surround ourselves with, if we only accept what they say as truth, we will be easily manipulated. If we don't listen to the opinions of others, of those not like us, and try to engage with those ideas, then we'll be manipulated right into doing or believing something that's actually not true. In the article I gave you for the first lesson on the other side is not wrong, by Sean Blanda, that's a piece I think that really explains this as well. The importance of getting outside of our own echo chamber and really hearing what others who are not like us think, at least giving those opinions a fair shake and considering them. The movie does this in an exaggerated way. Peter's senses, sight, touch, the things we rely on to understand the world, are what fail him here, because Mysterio, or Beck, the villain, is actually manipulating the world around him. So Peter can't trust his own senses. So it's an exaggeration. But really, in some ways, it's not that exaggerated, because if it's a metaphor for what we should be able to trust in the film, our senses, and reality, news or media in front of us, we can't trust things we could trust before when we think about news or media. So it's a metaphor, but it's not as exaggerated as it may seem. And it's a very poignant point, a really appropriate point for our 21st century culture. So playing the believing and doubting game here, following the student's logic, I think this makes sense, and I buy this analysis. But in order to have an effective argument like that, you've got to have those three pieces: the argument itself, the piece of evidence, which we saw in the last two slides, and finally the analysis of evidence, the link, the connection between the evidence and the claim to effectively prove the claim. I think the student does this, but as you can see, you've got to have all three. Finally, the last key strategy I mentioned was considering the larger context. So how is this relevant? Why does it matter? What cultural influences prompted this writer to produce this? I think it's kind of obvious with this paper, but the student says it really well in his conclusion. So let's take a look at that super quickly. To conclude, our culture has advanced from postmodernism to both diversity and division, telling the individual the lie that one can choose their truth based on what looks and sounds correct in the moment. We are more skeptical than ever about ideas that contradict our own, yet accept without question those that appear and feel familiar. In Spider-Man Far From Home, this contradiction is displayed when the interpretation of physical reality is manipulated to deceive a population desperate for superheroes. In the end, though, reality is saved from being overwhelmed by lies. One question we are left with is this: is our search for truth worth sacrificing the familiar for what is real? So, self-explanatory. I think we've already said it, but I just wanted to leave you with this note. I think this film really warns against the danger of trusting what we've always relied on, what feels familiar, and that we need to be adventurous. We need to listen to what others have to say, especially others who are not like us, instead of staying rigidly locked into our political divides, to learn and grow, to be critical consumers, and ultimately not be manipulated, because the reality of our world is that we are going to be manipulated by the media, and we have to take a stand against it, the way Spider-Man takes a stand against Mysterio. And my goal in this class is to help give you the tools, the skills to stand against media that manipulates you, and to create media yourself that spreads powerful truth. I said before that being able to sum up the thing you've read in one sentence is a great start to the reflective process of critical reading that begins after you've read the piece and annotated it. But after you've reflected on it, made notes, kind of really grappled with the text, you should be able to give a more thorough critique of it. Do you agree? Why or why not? What is worthwhile or relevant about it? So here are my conclusions about this paper. The student makes a clear argument about the meaning of the film Spider-Man Far From Home. He doesn't just say this is a film about Spider-Man fighting Mysterio. He says what ideas their battle conveys to the audience. The student also shows why the film is important and relevant by connecting its message to current cultural trends. We really saw that play out on the last few slides, but it's something I'm going to ask you to do not only in your discussion board post, but also in the papers you write for this class. The student thoroughly analyzes the film to prove the argument, so you've got that evidence to back it up. Finally, the film's message is clearly very important, since it reveals how easily media can manipulate us, for example, through fake news or plenty of other examples. And so I really explained why I think this film is so relevant and important, and why it can be a great launching off point for us for all the great things we're going to read, discuss, study, and write about in this class. And I thought this student paper would really illustrate it to you in a way better than I could. But I wanted to give you my analysis of the student paper as an example of critical reading. Hopefully what you've learned about critical reading in this lesson will help you in other classes in college when you have to read difficult texts, or when you have to read difficult texts for work, or anytime you have to read something challenging. Reading something challenging really makes the reading worthwhile. We gain something from it, and here's the skills or the strategies to do it. Finally, in our culture, we don't just read the written word. We encounter all kinds of media, particularly visual media. So now I would love for you to take what you've learned in this lesson and turn it toward providing your own analysis of Spider-Man Far From Home in the discussion board. And I cannot wait to read those posts. I'm really looking forward to it.